You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In a forgotten town deep in rural Kentucky, a respected hog farmer named Walt Culler was known for one thing: raising pigs big enough to eat anything. But when a beloved pastor's daughter vanished near his farm in 1998, suspicions simmered quietly, until 25 years later, after Walt died, investigators uncovered a hidden meat grinder, a chilling journal, and the truth behind a string of missing persons cases stretching back decades. What they found wasn't just evidence of murder, it was a decades-long ritual of feeding human remains to pigs, all in the name of purification. But the most terrifying part? Walt may have passed his methods down to someone else. If you crave bone-chilling true crime wrapped in dark ritual and buried secrets, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because at Soul Studios, the next nightmare might be waiting down your own back road. My name is Eli McRae, and I was a sheriff's deputy in the remote backcountry of Grayson Hollow for over 30 years. Today, I'm long retired, but there's one case that will haunt me until the day I die. It's a story that started in the late 1990s when I was just a rookie, eager to protect my quiet community. Back then, Grayson Hollow was the sort of place where nothing ever happened, or so we thought. Grayson Hollow sits at the end of a forgotten 2-lane highway that winds through dense forests and foggy marshland. Life moved slowly out here. Church on Sundays, diners full of truckers and farmers, and the constant background noise of hogs snorting and squealing from the local pig farms. The isolation kept our town insulated from big city crime. Neighbors knew each other, doors stayed unlocked, and we all felt safe. At least, that's what I believed on the day I first met Walt Culler. Walt Culler was a stoop-shouldered farmer in his late 50s who ran the largest hog farm in the Hollow. He was a man of few words and simple habits. Everyone in town knew Walt, or thought they did. He sold pork at the county market every month, attended church occasionally, he'd sit in the back pew, hat in hand, and never caused trouble. In those early days, I saw Walt as just another hard-working old-timer. He had a weather-beaten face, permanently etched with dirt and sunburn, and a tendency to hum old hymns under his breath while loading feed sacks. If anything, folks felt sorry for him. He'd lost his wife to cancer years back and lived all alone on that farm with nothing but his hogs for company. My first encounter with Walt was routine. A few weeks into my job, I was sent out to Walt's hog farm to respond to a loose livestock complaint. Some pigs had broken through a fence and wandered onto the highway. I remember pulling up the long dirt driveway flanked by sagging oaks and rusted farm equipment. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the only sign of life was a cluster of enormous black and pink hogs snuffling around the yard. They watched me with tiny, intelligent eyes as I stepped out of my cruiser, almost like they knew something I didn't. Walt emerged from a barn, wiping his hands on a bloody apron. He'd been butchering a hog, he explained casually. He greeted me with a polite nod and a firm handshake. Up close, his smell hit me, a mix of soil, sweat, and the coppery tang of pig's blood. "Sorry about the trouble, Deputy," Walt mumbled. He corralled the strays with surprising ease, tapping their rumps with a stick and murmuring, "Go on now, back in pen." The hogs obeyed like trained dogs. As I helped nail the broken fence slat, I noticed something odd. Deep grooves in the wooden posts, as if gnawed by teeth. "Darn pigs'll chew on anything when they're hungry," Walt said, noticing my gaze. "Heh, my hogs'll eat anything but the squeal," he added with a strange half-smile. I chuckled politely, thinking it was just farm humor I didn't quite get. That phrase meant nothing to me then. It chills me to my core now. At that time, nothing about Walt Culler raised alarm. If anything, I admired his dedication. The man lived alone, tending over 100 hogs, a tough life for an aging farmer. I drove off that day with the image of Walt waving in my rearview mirror, a solitary figure against the dusky sky, the hogs milling at his feet. Grayson Hollow felt as normal as ever. But soon, normal life in Grayson Hollow would be shattered. It started with one missing person, a disappearance that rocked our small community. Her name was Leanne Driscoll. She was the 19-year-old daughter of Pastor Driscoll, the minister at the only church in Grayson Hollow. Leanne was beloved, choir singer, straight-A student, the kind of good soul who volunteered at bake sales and helped her neighbours. On an ordinary summer evening, Leanne vanished without a trace. I remember that day in vivid flashes. It was July 14th, 1998. The sun had just set, leaving a purple-orange glow over the endless fields. I was locking up the sheriff's office when Pastor Driscoll burst in, his face ashen and eyes wide with panic. "Leanne didn't come home," he said, voice trembling. Within an hour, half the town had gathered with flashlights and pickup trucks to search the country roads and surrounding woods for any sign of her. We searched through the night, calling her name into the dark. I felt a sickening weight in my stomach. She was a careful girl, not the type to run off. We found her car parked on the shoulder of Route 16, just a mile from Walt Culler's farm, the driver's door still open. The car had a flat tire, as if she'd pulled over for help or to change it. On the passenger seat was a Bible and a half-empty water bottle. Leanne's phone, back then it was a brick-sized Nokia, was in the glove box, no calls made. It was like she stepped out of the car and evaporated into the humid summer air. I joined a group that headed toward Walt's property, fanning out through the tall grass and hollering her name. The night was eerily quiet, except for the chorus of crickets and the distant grunts of hogs echoing from Walt's barns. We eventually found Walt himself out on his porch, drawn by our shouts. He seemed genuinely concerned. "What's this about?" he asked in his gruff drawl. When we told him, he even grabbed a lantern and joined the search. Walt, the pastor, and I trudged through his acreage, checking the old well, the tool sheds, even the edge of the swamp behind his fields. At one point, I thought I caught a whiff of something rotten on the breeze, sickly sweet and foul, but it quickly dissipated. We found nothing that night. As dawn broke, our hopes faded. The only thing we did find was one of Leanne's sandals on the side of the road, a few hundred yards from her car, as if she had taken off running or been carried. We didn't say it out loud, but we all thought the same thing. Someone must have taken her. Leanne's disappearance hit Grayson Hollow hard. For weeks, volunteers combed every inch of the area. We dredged the pond, searched abandoned shacks in the woods, questioned every passing traveller. No clues, no witnesses, nothing. It was as if the hollow itself had swallowed her whole. I remember Pastor Driscoll standing at the pulpit the Sunday after she vanished, voice cracking as he pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. I also remember glancing at Walt Culler in the back pew that day. His head was bowed, eyes closed as if in prayer. He looked upset, but later I wondered, was he hiding something behind that solemn pose? At 22 years old, I was devastated that we couldn't find Leanne. It was my first big case, and I took it personally. I couldn't shake the guilt or the nagging feeling that we had missed something. Eventually, as the summer waned, the searches were called off. The state police assumed she was likely abducted by a passing trucker or simply ran away, though those who knew her fiercely rejected that idea. With no leads, Leanne Driscoll became another cold case. The Hollow tried to move on, but a shadow of fear and grief lingered. Parents kept their kids closer, and for the first time, people started locking their doors at night. After Leanne, the quiet years in Grayson Hollow were never quite as innocent. I remained a deputy, gaining experience, but I never forgot her case. What none of us realized then was that Leanne's disappearance was just the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch on for decades. People were going missing. Drifters, hitchhikers, addicts, the sort of folks who passed through town or lived on the fringes, whose absences didn't make headlines. Looking back, the pattern seems so obvious, but at the time each case felt isolated, tragic but not connected. In 2003, a transient named Roger Polk drifted into town. He was a scruffy middle-aged guy doing odd jobs for cash. One June morning, Roger was gone. His few friends recalled he'd planned to hitchhike north. We found his backpack hidden under a bridge outside town, but no sign of Roger. The assumption, he left on his own or met misfortune on the road. I filed the report, one more missing person in the state database, and life went on. A couple years later, in 2005, rumours swirled about a prostitute from a nearby city last seen getting into a pickup truck on our highway. Some said it was a red truck. Walt drove an old red Ford F-150. I questioned Walt about it casually when I ran into him at the feed store. He shrugged it off calmly. "Lots of red trucks around here, Deputy. Wish I could help you." His eyes were steady. I detected no lie. Back then, I had no concrete reason to suspect him. After all, the woman's trail went cold well beyond our county line, and no evidence tied her to Grayson Hollow besides a rumour, so I let it drop. But I kept a mental tally. Over the years, the missing persons list tied to our area grew longer than it should have for a one-horse town. Drifters who camped in the woods and vanished, an occasional motorist who never reached their destination, an ex-convict nobody missed until much later. In isolation, each case had an explanation: runaway, accident, overdose. But together? Something was very wrong in Grayson Hollow. By 2010, I was a seasoned deputy. Sheriff Gaines, my mentor, often told me, "Eli, you got good instincts, but don't go chasing ghosts." He knew I was hung up on these disappearances. I couldn't prove it, but a dark suspicion had taken root in my mind, a suspicion that pointed me back to Walt Culler's lonely hog farm. What kept bothering me was Leanne's case. In the years since, I replayed that night over and over. Why hadn't we found any trace of her? Not a body, not clothing, besides the one sandal. Nothing. Predators, animal or human, usually leave a trail. It was like she'd been erased. The only place near where she vanished that we hadn't fully scoured was Walt's property, and we had gone over parts of it, with Walt himself by our side. Could we have missed something? The thought gnawed at me. One evening, after another fruitless attempt to connect the dots on the recent missing drifters, I decided to pay Walt an unofficial visit. It was late autumn 2011, with dusk falling early and a chill in the air. I drove out to Walt's farm under the pretense of checking on him before a forecasted storm, a friendly welfare check on an old resident. In truth, I wanted to look around with fresh eyes. Walt welcomed me in his usual gruff but polite way. We stood in his front yard as a light rain began to fall, and he lit an oil lantern, casting dancing shadows across the mud. His hogs sensed the weather and were unusually noisy, a cacophony of low grunts and shrill squeals emanating from the barn. I casually asked Walt if I could take shelter in the barn with him while he fed the pigs, hoping to observe anything. Inside the main hog barn, the stench was overpowering, a foul mix of manure and decay that made me instinctively cover my nose. Pigs of all sizes crowded in pens, agitated by hunger. I noticed Walt's herd had grown. There were more hogs than I recalled, some of them alarmingly large. Walt filled a trough with feed and kitchen scraps, and the hogs surged with almost frightening aggression, tearing at the food. Over the clamour, I shouted a question that had been on my mind. "You ever find anything strange out here, Walt? Any remains, from animals or otherwise?" It was a thinly veiled query. My heart pounded as I waited for his response. Walt paused, the lantern light exaggerating the lines on his face. "Can't say I have, Deputy," he replied after a moment, his tone steady. "Just dead chickens now and then, foxes get 'em." I nodded, disappointed by his ordinary answer and feeling a bit foolish for hoping he'd slip up. As I turned to leave, a particularly loud squeal made me jump. One huge sow had shoved another aside, causing a brief fight. The sound was eerily like a human scream. I flinched, and Walt chuckled at my reaction. With a wry grin, he repeated, "Told ya, these hogs will eat anything but the squeal." This time, the joke sent a prickling dread through my spine. In the lantern glow, Walt's eyes looked almost feverish as he watched the pigs devour their slop. For a split second, his face, half in shadow, appeared utterly strange to me, like I was truly seeing him for the first time. A man who spent too long in the company of pigs. A man with secrets. I left the farm that night with a heavy unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that Walt's words hid a darker meaning. Over the next few years, each time a new missing person report crossed my desk, I thought of Walt and his hogs. But I had no evidence. Walt remained a respected, if somewhat reclusive, member of the community. He never remarried or had kids, though at one point I heard he'd taken in a foster boy for a short while. More on that later. He paid his taxes, came to town for supplies, and even donated sausages for the church fundraiser every spring. To everyone else, Walt Culler was just an eccentric old farmer living out his days. Yet, I started hearing odd stories around town. A trucker once mentioned to me over coffee at the diner that he hated driving Route 16 at night. When I asked why, he said, "That stretch by the hollow. I swear I've seen shapes moving in the fields, and sometimes I hear screams. Not sure if it's animals or something else." I told him it was probably coyotes or pigs fighting, but I made a note of it. A teenager from a neighbouring town told some of our local kids that he spent a night near Grayson Hollow on a dare, camped out in the woods. He claimed he heard a man talking to his pigs, almost like a preacher giving a sermon in the middle of the night. The man's voice carried through the trees, ranting about sacrifice and cleansing sin. The kids laughed it off as the boy trying to scare them, and I didn't hear about this story until much later. But Walt's farm was the only homestead for miles in that area. It had to be him, right? I remember one particularly unsettling incident around 2015. A known petty thief, Jerry Lutz, had been released from jail and was passing through Grayson Hollow, likely up to no good. One night, I got a call from Walt. It was the first time he'd ever phoned me. In his slow drawl, Walt said there was an intruder snooping around his property. I sped over there, fearing a violent confrontation. When I arrived, I found Walt at his front gate, shotgun in hand, looking rattled. He led me to a tool shed where he said he'd seen the trespasser last. The door was ajar. Inside, we found a few drops of fresh blood on the dirt floor and Jerry Lutz's baseball cap, but no Jerry. Walt claimed Jerry must have cut himself breaking in and then ran off when he heard Walt approach. We searched the property and beyond, calling Jerry's name, but he was long gone. I filed an incident report and later a missing person report when Jerry never turned up elsewhere. Officially, it was logged as likely fled the area, given his criminal background. Unofficially, my gut was screaming that something terrible had happened on that farm that night. Walt's demeanour as we searched for Jerry was telling. He seemed annoyed more than worried, muttering that drifters and lowlifes brought trouble on themselves. I'll never forget, as I was leaving, Walt looked me in the eye and said almost apologetically, "Shame about that fella, but out here in the hollow you learn quick. Hogs'll eat whatever you give 'em." It wasn't the words, it was the way he said it, with a quiet conviction that sent a jolt of realization through me. I managed a nod and left, my mind reeling. That night I hardly slept. I lay in bed connecting dots that I'd been too afraid to connect before. The transients, the hitchhikers, the petty criminals, even sweet innocent Leanne, they all vanished near Grayson Hollow, near Walt's farm. And Walt always had a perfect explanation or an alibi of being helpful. I began to suspect that the reason we never found bodies was because there were no bodies left to find. I considered what had once been unthinkable. Could Walt Culler be a serial killer, preying on the vulnerable and feeding them to his hogs? The mere thought was so grotesque, I wanted to dismiss it as a wild imagination. But once the idea lodged in my brain, I couldn't dislodge it. Still, suspicion isn't proof. I had nothing solid to take to the sheriff or a judge for a search warrant, just a bunch of missing people who had no obvious connection to Walt, plus my increasingly unsettled intuition. I decided to keep a closer eye on Walt. Over the next couple of years, I'd occasionally park on a hill that overlooked part of his farm, using binoculars to watch the place from afar on my off time. It felt wrong, almost obsessive, but I told myself I was protecting the town. I never saw much out of the ordinary, Walt tending his hogs, Walt driving to town, Walt repairing his tractor. Once, though, I did notice late at night he'd light a fire in a distant field and stand before it as if conducting some ritual. I was too far to see clearly, but I heard the distant droning of what might have been a hymn carried on the breeze. The scene was so eerie I had to suppress a shudder. When I asked Walt casually the next day if he'd been burning something, he said just some brush clearing. I didn't believe him. By 2020, Walt was in his late 70s, yet still surprisingly spry. The missing persons cases had slowed down by then, or perhaps I was just less aware, having been semi-retired and consulting only occasionally. The world was caught up in other concerns, pandemics, politics, and the transient traffic through Grayson Hollow dwindled. Walt mostly kept to himself. I began to hope that maybe I'd been wrong all along, or if I was right, perhaps the horror was finally over. How naive that hope was. The weird events weren't over. The worst was yet to come. And it would arrive, ironically, when none of us could do anything to stop Walt Culler. Because by the time the truth fully came out, Walt was already dead. On a frigid January morning in 2023, Walt Culler's reign of quiet terror came to an end. It was a neighbour, a farmer from 5 miles down, who called it in. She noticed Walt's pigs were squealing non-stop for 2 days, and Walt, who usually came into town on Tuesdays, hadn't shown up. I was officially retired by then, but old habits die hard. I still carried a police band radio and heard the call go out. Something in my gut told me to head over there. When I arrived at Walt's farm, 2 younger deputies were already on scene. They looked pale and shocked. "Eli, you'd better brace yourself," one warned me. We stepped into the hog pen together, and I immediately saw why they were shaken. Walt Culler's body lay in the mud near the feeding trough, or rather what was left of it. It seemed Walt had suffered a heart attack or stroke while feeding his hogs, and in the cold, cruel logic of nature, the hogs had helped themselves to their fallen owner. His face was mercifully intact, eyes glassy and staring at the winter sky, but from the waist down, it was a mangled, chewed horror. I swallowed hard, stomach turning, a mix of revulsion and grim vindication swirling inside me. The hogs had finally done to him what he'd possibly done to so many others. We secured the hogs and removed Walt's remains. As the coroner took over, I found myself wandering that farm with a determination born of years of uncertainty. Walt's death meant we could search every inch without restriction, and I was damn sure going to. I think the deputies and my old sheriff understood. They let me spearhead the search of the property I'd been eyeing for so long. What we found confirmed every worst fear I ever had. It started in a shack behind the barn, padlocked tight. We pried it open and were immediately hit with the stench of death, far worse than normal farm smells. Inside, in the gloom, we discovered an old industrial meat grinder, caked with dark, dried matter. My flashlight passed over the ghastly device. The metal was nicked and scratched from years of use, and in the teeth of the grinder were embedded fragments that looked suspiciously like bone and something fibrous. Hair. My heart pounded as we also found hooks on the ceiling, like a makeshift abattoir. On a grimy table to the side there were souvenirs, a line of objects laid out carefully and covered in dust, an assortment of ID cards, jewellery and personal trinkets. I saw a lady's watch, a locket, several wallets, even a small silver cross necklace. My breath caught. I recognized that necklace. It belonged to Leanne Driscoll. I remembered her parents showing it to me in a photo. I steadied myself on the table as the reality washed over me. Walt had kept trophies from his victims. Decades' worth of missing people were represented here in this silent shack of horrors. A fellow deputy rushed outside to vomit. I felt like doing the same, but I was transfixed. Among those items I counted at least 15 distinct keepsakes, 15 human lives. And that was likely not even all of them, just the ones he chose to keep. Then we found the journal. It was sitting on a wooden chair in the corner, as if Walt might have been writing in it recently. The cover was thick leather, stained with grease and age. Inside, brittle yellow pages were filled with tight cursive handwriting. The first date went back to 1995. My hands trembled as I opened to a random entry. In one entry, dated August 3rd, 1998, just weeks after Leanne disappeared, Walt wrote in an eerie, detached tone about a young woman with a pure soul who wandered into the hollow like a lost lamb. He detailed how he offered her as feed for the hogs, a sacrament to cleanse her of sin. I felt bile rise in my throat. He was describing Leanne's death in grotesque poetry. He wrote that she screamed prayers until the end, and that her sacrifice would ensure a good harvest and purify the hollow. Each word was more deranged than the last, laced with biblical references twisted beyond recognition. Walt had delusions of being some kind of dark priest, and the hogs were his instruments of purification. We pored over the journal for hours, horrified yet desperate to catalogue every atrocity. The entries were meticulous. Walt recorded at least 2 to 3 offerings per year. Hitchhikers picked up on the road, drifters who stopped at his farm asking for work, even a couple of local lowlifes like Jerry Lutz who crossed his path. He mentioned mixing sedatives into whiskey he'd offer these sinners, or sometimes catching them off guard and knocking them out with a hammer. Then he'd drag them to the shack, say a prayer of expiation, and push them alive, oh God, or dead through that meat grinder. The remains, flesh, bone, blood, he'd collect and feed to his ravenous hogs. Their bodies are devoured, and their sins along with them, he wrote. Thus the land is cleansed. I had to step outside for air, retching and shaking with anger and grief. All those years, all those people we never found. Walt had been right under our noses, performing his sacrament while we chalked the disappearances up to bad luck and transient life. I felt a crushing guilt. I was the one who had stood in that very barn next to Walt, hearing the screams of his pigs, screams that I now knew were sometimes the final cries of his victims. Anything but the squeal. That phrase reverberated in my mind with new meaning. The only thing the hogs wouldn't consume was the scream, the last breath of terror. Walt must have found that darkly poetic. Back inside the shack, amidst our search, we discovered one final journal entry. The last entry. It was dated December 2022, just weeks before Walt died. In shaky handwriting, as Walt was clearly aging and possibly ill, he wrote, "My hands grow weak, and the winter of my life is here. But I feel no fear, for I have been the vessel of God's cleansing fire. Each soul I sent through the grinder, each body I fed to the hogs was a sacrament. Their sins were great, addiction, lust, vanity, theft, and I purified them in the bellies of swine, as our Lord did cast the demons into the pigs in Scripture. I have done what must be done in this wicked world. Yet the work cannot end with me. I have prepared a successor, a son to continue tending the herd and delivering the sacrament. He understands our holy mission. When I am called to account before the Almighty, I shall say I did my duty, and through my boy the pigs will remain fed, the cleansing will continue." A cold chill settled over me as I read and reread that passage. A successor? A son? Walt never had children of his own. But I recalled that brief period, around 2016, when Walt took in a foster child from the county orphan program, a troubled 14-year-old named Jacob. The boy had stayed only about a year before records showed he was transferred to another home. We never heard of Jacob again. At the time, no one paid much attention. Foster situations change often. Now my blood ran cold with the realization Walt's foster son wasn't transferred. He'd been groomed. Possibly groomed to become the next butcher of Grayson Hollow. The implications of that final entry were almost more terrifying than everything that came before. We alerted state police to track down Jacob, but the paper trail was thin. It appeared records might have been falsified or destroyed. It's possible Jacob never even used his real name after he left Walt's. A new missing person, one we didn't even know was missing. And if Walt's journal was true, Jacob was out there somewhere, a young man now in his 20s, carrying the twisted teachings of Walt Culler like a plague. In the aftermath of the discovery, news of Walt Culler's evil spread quickly, horrifying our community and the entire nation. Investigators swarmed the farm for weeks, excavating the grounds. They found hundreds of bone fragments and teeth buried in the pigsties' mud and in the pigs' feces, confirming that countless bodies had been disposed of there over the years. Forensic analysts identified remains or personal effects linking Walt to at least 24 disappearances stretching back to the 1980s. The scale was staggering. Walt Culler might have been one of the most prolific serial killers in state history, all while living a quiet, unassuming life. I was left to grapple with my own emotions. I felt relief that the truth was finally uncovered, but also overwhelming remorse. Could I have saved lives if I'd pushed harder years ago? The weight of those lost souls is something I carry every day. In my nightmares, I still hear the piercing squeals of Walt's hogs, and I see the innocent face of Leanne Driscoll, the girl whose fate first opened my eyes to this horror. The authorities tried to reassure the public that Walt's evil died with him. But I knew better. There was that unresolved thread of Walt's final journal entry, the mention of a successor. Every few months I check in with the state task force to see if there's any lead on Jacob or any unexplained disappearances that fit the pattern. So far, nothing conclusive. But in quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can't help but wonder if out there somewhere, in another rural town or anonymous city edge, a young man with a hollow look in his eyes is continuing Walt's sacrament. Sometimes I drive by the old Grayson Hollow farm, which now stands abandoned. The fields are overgrown, the barn collapsed in on itself. No one will live there again. Yet, on certain nights when the wind is right, as I pass, I could swear I hear faint echoes of hogs squealing in the dark. It's probably just my mind playing tricks, or perhaps it's the land itself whispering its memories of what happened there. I often find myself standing by Leanne Driscoll's grave in the church cemetery. We finally laid a part of her to rest. Her locket and a few bone fragments identified as hers were buried beneath a headstone that reads "Beloved Daughter, 1979-1998. I apologized to her and to all of them, the ones we failed. The pastor, Leanne's father, has forgiven me in time, but I haven't forgiven myself. In my retirement, I occasionally get asked to speak at law enforcement conferences about the case, a case that underscores how evil can fester unnoticed and how gut instincts should never be ignored. I recount the facts, but what I truly convey is the feeling, the oppressive darkness that hung over Grayson Hollow for so long, and the way a whole community's innocence was devoured by one man's madness. As for Walt Culler, his remains were cremated, and no one claimed the ashes. Fittingly, I suppose, nothing remains of him, much like nothing remained of his victims. And if his foster son is truly out there continuing his work, maybe one day justice will catch up with him too. Now, every so often a story will hit the news of a missing hitchhiker or an addict disappearing in a town not far from here, and my blood runs cold. I pray it's not him. I pray Walt's evil truly died with those pigs that ate him. But a part of me is always on guard, always listening for that telltale detail. A hidden meat grinder discovered, a hog farm that people whisper about, because I know firsthand the kind of horror that can hide behind the most unassuming eyes of a simple farmer. In the end, the tale of Walt Culler leaves me with a lesson and a warning I'll never forget. Evil might not always lurk in the shadows of a city alley. Sometimes it wears muddy boots and a friendly smile, tending pigs on a quiet farm road. And sometimes the greatest horrors go unnoticed for years, only to be revealed when it's far too late. I still wake up some nights, heart-pounding, haunted by the things I've seen in Grayson Hollow. In those moments, I remind myself of the hard truth I learned out on that lonely hog farm. Some killers bury their victims. Others let the pigs do it for them.
Every story has an end, but here the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.